Aloha, and back to the last segment of our pineapple quilt block series. We're going to talk about some of the tools that you will need in order to complete your little block. You're going to need a mat for sewing, or rather for ironing, because you will need to do some pressing on your block. There are some rulers that you will want to have. I'm going to recommend rulers that I use. This is Quilter Select. What I like about it is that it has an edge on the back of it that allows you to put it down, press it, and it holds the fabric in place, so you don't have to worry about the ruler sliding. The next thing that you'll really want is called an add a quarter plus. And some of you may already have the add a quarter. The advantage to the add a quarter plus is that you can use both sides of this ruler while you're making your pineapple block, and we'll show you how that works in just a few minutes. You'll want some little bitty scissors for cutting on your fabric. You are going to cut your fabric, and I have a variety of different rotary cutters here, and you'll need a rotary mat. When I set up on my sewing machine, I have a table that's called Sew Steady, and what's nice about it is it gives me a work surface that's a little extra, and I can set my cutting mat right up on it, and as I'm cutting my squares, I can cut squares with it. I have a different variety of rotary cutters. I like them all for different reasons. This is Quilter Select. It can be used both for a left-handed or a right-handed person, and if for some reason you want a little more weight when you're bearing down, I kind of like it a lot when I'm doing batting. That works well. This is the new Sassy by Alpha, and what's wonderful about it is it has a little flip here for turning on and off, and when you change it, all you do now is just push down and you can change your blade. None of us having to unscrew everything, so it makes it really wonderful. And then this is another one. You can buy it for a left-handed or a right-handed person. This particular one is by Martelli, and I really like it because it flips, and then you can actually set it down here like that, and I don't have to, every time I turn around, flip the blade a little bit. They may not want me to say that, but it does work really well for that. So that's the one that I'll be cutting with. Now, the next thing that you'll want to do is have something to iron with. Now, there's several different theories on this one. This is Clover's little pressing iron, and you can simply press, and it does get really hot, so I'll warn you ahead of time, but you can use that to press with. Sometimes what I do is I don't finger press because I have really short nails, but I will use the edge of my ruler and just go back, put things into place, and then when my block is done, I will go ahead and I will press. We will talk about pressing briefly. Pressing is when you take the iron, you push down, you go up, down, and up. Ironing is what you've been doing for years when you iron your clothes. You went back and forth. So if you are pressing, you go down and up. You do not go down and up. As soon as you make a sideways motion, you are no longer pressing, you are ironing. So that's the only thing you'll want to remember, because if you iron your blocks, they can distort, because remember, we're sewing on the bias. So now we have all of our little tools here together, and next thing we have to have, obviously, is some fabric. And for fabric, you can use a variety of things. Because we're usually most of the time either using a 2.5 inch wide or a 1.5 inch wide piece of fabric, you'll find pre-cuts work really well. They have them, someone call them pixies. Those are the 1.5, also called honey buns, depending on the manufacturer. And then we're all familiar with jelly rolls. And then of course there's regular fabric that you can, in the form of yardage, and you can just take that and cut it. You will need, for sure, a little glue stick. Now I just buy a bunch of the little bitty purple Elmer's glue sticks. They wash out when you do your laundry, and they're just real easy and they're cheap. So they have the advantage. There are two other things that you may find you may want to use. Here is some fray check. On some very rare occasion, you may have a really skimpy little seam or something, or you may have an area that you're nervous about coming loose, and you can use fray check to hold the thread down. Also, when you're sewing things together, sometimes you might want to use a little bit of school glue to hold things in place. If you have a really tricky block that just, maybe you made the mistake and it got a little distorted and you need to really hold it in place. And then fabric fusion is my go-to friend, and I'll explain to you what I do with it a little bit later. Projects sort of like when I'm getting ready to go on a trip. I get all excited and I want to make sure that my machine is ready to go, so I clean it on the inside and out, and I make sure my machine has to be oiled. Your machine may not have to be oiled, so with that framework, you need to check your manual, see what you need to do with your machine in order to prepare it. I always start with a nice fresh needle, especially when you are paper foundation piecing. You will discover that your needle can, during the process of sewing, get dull. And you'll know it's dull simply because you start off sewing with a new needle and everything is just gliding and it's wonderful. And then somewhere during the project you start noticing that you're having to maybe push a little bit, or it just doesn't want to slide as much. It's time for a new needle. And there's nothing wrong with replacing the needle. You do not have to wait until it breaks. You know who you are out there. I've been known to be that guilty myself. Now what you'll want to do is on your sewing machine, you will want to adjust the stitch length on it so that it's fairly close together. Now I have noticed with my machine that depending on the kind of paper I use depends on what stitch length I want to use. If I'm using something more like purchased papers, like the Fat Quarter Shop, or I'm using copy paper, I may have to have my stitch a little bit wider because my machine kind of wants to gum down too much if it's too close. But I've noticed that I work really well when I have the Carol Doak paper, and I'm usually about 170 on it, and so it's fairly simple. Now, some people tell you that you need a light box. You have all kinds of things that you have to go through in order to figure out where your middle block is. This will be your starting point. You see it's number 1 here. Now, what I've done is I have cut some papers, not papers but fabric, and I always allow myself an inch for the length of the block. So what that means is if I have a block and it's 5 inches long, I'm going to want to have it large enough so that it has enough room on each side for a 1/4 inch seam, and also on the ends for a 1/4 inch seam. So that adds an inch to the block, roughly. So when I start, I also like to have a bigger square. The reason for that is I don't want to have to slave over how I exactly piece this in the middle, and I don't want to have to break out my light box to do it. And I've noticed that if I hold up my paper, I can see through it. Now, you may not be able to see through it, but I can. So what I do with that is I take my little square, and I take out my little glue stick, and I just kind of go around my little block, and I fill it in a little bit. Depends on my mood. And then I take my block, I hold it up a little bit to the light so I can see it, and I place it here. Now in this particular case, I am using solid fabric, so you can't really see what's happening here. But the first block that you put down is the hardest block, because you have to remember that this goes right side up and your paper is upside down. Your numbers are on this side, and on this side you are going to place your fabric in the beginning. So what you're going to do is, now that you can see, if you look really closely, I've managed to get that in the middle. I'm now going to go to block number 2. When I go to block number 2, I take my ruler and I take it and I place it right along that seam line, and then I fold back. And when I fold back, I now have the line that I'm going to be ready. That eventually will be a seam. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take my add a quarter, and on this side there's a lip, and on my ruler I simply take it and I take my rotor cutter, put it in place, and cut through my fabric. When I do this, I usually keep a little waste basket at the bottom here. I have now made a straight seam. This is really important because this is actually a 1/4 inch seam. Now, if I look here, my first fabric that goes on here is going to be white. And I've cut some strips. Now what I do is I can take my little strip and I can put it in place right across my fabric. Now some people don't pin. I do. Only because, I don't know, some days I sew and everything is perfect. There are other days I sew and I don't know if my brain dead or whatever, but I don't sew as well as I should. Now everyone has a favorite foot that they like to use. Now on my Bernina, I use a little bit different foot. This is a 39, and the reason that I'm using it is because this foot is clear and it has a little red line that goes down the middle where my needle is going to sew. And if I look at that red line, I don't have to look at the needle. I just look at the red line, which is really easy to see, and it sews right down my line. Now when I start to sew, I always try and sew 2 stitches off or before the line starts. And the reason for that is you just want to have a little gentle overlap as you're sewing, because you're going to be crossing over lines. So now I have started. I have set my machine for a 1.70 stitch length, and now I'm going to sew. And now I'm making my straight line. It is important, you do want to sew straight, because if you don't, when you go to put your pineapple block together again, it won't fit properly, and that would be really frustrating. Now I have sewn my little line here. And now at this point, I'm ready to take it and I'm ready to flip it. Now for me, I have found that if I just take the edge of my ruler and I go like this, I have set my seam in place. And I don't really need to press it. Later I will press, but for now I don't need to. And that just saves on a little bit of time. Now I am ready to do square number 3. Square number 3 is very simple. Going to do the same process. I'm going to bring the ruler right up to the edge. I'm going to fold back. Now this is not rocket science, it's not really hard. If for some reason you didn't get it right on the line, so just reposition it and fold it over. But you'll find most of the time it's pretty accurate. If you do not have an add a quarter plus, then you'll need to use something like a thin piece of cardboard, or whether to fold back on, just to put that little crease line in. Now, I'm now ready for my next row. Now, this is really like regular sewing. You're putting your 2 right sides together. So this is the right side of your fabric, this is the back side. Again, a little difficult to see that when you're just sewing on solid fabric. Much easier when you're sewing on a printed fabric. And or if you're sewing on batiks, that's really great because there is no right or wrong side. So you can never make a mistake. So once again, I start off. You know, I'm sewing a little fast. I may not want to do that when you first start off or whatever. But we're pretty straightforward here. It's been really simple. Again, because I pinned it, it's kind of in place. So now I just simply take it, I fold back. At this point, you could take your little clover iron and you could iron this in place. It is not the end of the world if you press on your mat. Just don't keep it down there a real long time. But I have pressed on this mat as well. As you can tell from looking at this mat, it's several years old and I've used it a lot. Now my next one is number 4. And that's what's really nice about a pineapple block. In most instances, all you have to do is count. Usually you're going to end up, you know, with a block number 33 or so, depending on how many you've done. And you just keep doing it in order. There are blocks that are done alphabetically, and they go A, B, C, and so on. That drives me a little crazy because I always find out I end up singing the alphabet song and I get that stuck in my head and I cannot get rid of it. Now you'll notice that something's beginning to happen. We're beginning to cross over a little bit on some of this fabric, and that doesn't matter because we're just going to cut through it and toss our little free ends away. So now we're ready to do the next little piece, and how we're going to do that is we're going to go over here to number 5. Excuse me, to number 4. Can't even count here today. So here's number 4. I did it like that. I'm going to put this in place. And you'll soon discover that it's really hard to make a mistake when you're sewing these blocks together. Because once you start sewing them, you get a rhythm. And you almost know where you're supposed to go. In my particular case, I just want to make sure I caught the paper. Now, if you don't have this down really flat, you can end up sewing where you don't want to sew, and then you have to unsew. It's not the end of the world. You really can't mess these things up. You just go back and unsew a little bit. Now we're going to sew it in place again. Can you see clearly, Scott?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, I find that little red line is really helpful. Some people like to use an open toe foot. That works too. I use open toe feet all the time, especially when I'm stitching in the ditch. So it just depends on what you want. But I found that this works really good for me because I can see that little red line and not have to worry about it so much. So now we're ready to take this and we fold it back. And again, I'm just taking this and scraping it back. Now there's something that you will also notice, usually about the 3rd row in when you've been sewing, you'll start noticing that you're getting gaps between the rows when you sew them. That is normal on a pineapple block. Do not be concerned, because when you do the next row, it will fill in that little space. So don't panic when you see that and think, oh, I've done it wrong. Now you notice here I'm going to kind of go back again, because I was just maybe a little off when I did my line. So I want to make sure it's nice and straight here. And that's really important when you get to the edges and stuff, because you want your pineapple block to be sure and line up really well. And that is the advantage to doing it on the paper. You're not really going to be so stressed about that. Now you notice I had pulled a little thread, I just kind of pushed it back and now it's there. You really don't want to have to redo your pineapple blocks, but sometimes you will make a mistake. Over here I have a product called Eileen's Fabric Fusion. And this is my last resort when I have just made an unforgivable mistake and I have to fix it. And an example of that would be when I was sewing my king-size quilt. I had sewn 5 rows together. It had been a really long day. I'd been sewing all day. And when I got to the end, oh, fine. When I got up the next day and I looked at my quilt, I took one look at it and said, what is wrong with that quilt? And I realized that smack dab in the middle of all these little blocks, I had taken my center block and I had put the fabric in upside down. And maybe no one would ever have noticed that, but I did. To me, it stuck out like a sore thumb. So now I had to fix it. Well, I had sewn a bunch of blocks. They are all together. They're all sewn together. And I didn't want to have to take that out, sew a whole new block, re-sew everything, and it just would have been a mess. So what I ended up doing is I unsewed it. Now you'll notice that we have done the white row. Now we're to blue. Our last one was 5, so our next one is 6. And when we come to 6, we just take 6, we fold it back down. And now you'll notice we've been sewing a little bit off. What happens is you'll see there's some little bit of thread here. You can just take your finger and go like that and swoosh it down, and you don't have to worry about your block coming undone. Everything's still in place. And now all you do is you take your next piece of fabric and you put it in place. And then you're going to sew it in place. I'm going to make a little peek here just to make sure that I have covered my block really well. And pieces are large enough, that should happen. And now I'm ready to sew my next little block. Now when I went to repair my block that I made the mistake, what I simply did, I'll show you when I flip this over. So now we have the beginning of what looks like our little flying geese pattern. I went back, this block had all totally been sewn, and I flipped it over and I undid the stitches here. When I did that, that freed up this whole little block. I then flipped the block, put it where it belonged, and then I put everything back in place just by finger pressing. Now I couldn't sew it back in place, so I could have maybe tried by hand, but that was still not really going to work. So what I did is I have a little top like this. I get these like at the hobby store, and there'll be a bunch of them real cheap, and it gives you a real fine tip on the end. You can put it on here, you take that lid off and do it, and then I took the glue and I put it all along the little edge on the inside, and then I simply press down, and then I set that block aside. Actually, in this case, part of the quilt, set it aside, put a bunch of really heavy books on it, and let it sit overnight. And then when I was done, I took them off. You cannot tell that that block had not been sewn. And what I know about Fabric Fusion by Eileen is that I can actually take that, I can take whatever I fuse together, put it in the washing machine in the dryer, and it does not come undone. So if you make a mistake, you can fix your mistake. So now you have seen how we actually sew, and it's very simple. If you can count, you can do this technique. Now when we get done with our block, this is what it looks like. You come all the way to here. Now this is where I would normally take my block, and in fact I actually already pressed this one. What I did with this block is I took it like this, I laid it on my pressing mat, and there I have a variety of pressing mats. I have one here by Martelli, and this is the wool one that I've been using. And then what I simply did is I took my iron and I pressed. And remember what I said when you're pressing? It's down, it's up, it's down, it's up, it's down, it's up. Now this little iron is by Panasonic. It's really nice because it's cordless. And it's really handy if you have a really big something you don't want to have to be moving around. It works for little things too. But it's really great because you don't have to worry about the cord. Now when I was done with the one side, I simply took it and I pressed the other side. And remember, I said press as opposed to iron, because it's really important to only press. For people that have done garment sewing, that's really not a problem for you because you've been setting seams for years, and that's how you set a seam. Now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to show you how you cut your block, because this is the next step before you sew your blocks together. And it's just really, really simple. This is using the 8-inch block that I showed you I'm furnishing you. And on this block, you'll notice that it has a seam line and a cut line at the top and the bottom. But on the sides, all it has, it goes all the way out to the edge of the paper, and all it has is the cut line. I always sew just beyond the edge of the seam so that I don't have to worry about anything coming undone. Then what you do is you take your little ruler, and that's why I like this ruler so much. It's a little jobby here. It's really handy. I don't have to sorry about that. I didn't get you close to the sewing machine here. So I'm going to cut my lines. Now, when people make their blocks, some people, after they finish the block, like to take all the papers out.
Go.
So we cut. Now, so if you come along this line, I'm going to cut it. Now, I like to leave the papers in, because if I leave the paper, I'm for sure everything is going to stay in place, and I don't have to worry so much about the bias lines and any fabric distortion. So that is my favorite. If you are sewing a really large quilt, like the king size quilt, you'll find that every, maybe about 4 or 5 rows, you will need to remove some of the paper just because it gets so awkward to put it under your sewing machine. But now here's our block, and it's totally finished and it's ready to go. And we would just simply put them together, sew them on the sides, and pin them. And by leaving the paper in, it just makes it easier. When you go to tear the paper out, you want to do it in the reverse manner that you sewed. The very last block on here was 33. So what you would simply want to do is take this, fold it over, and pull off your paper. And you'll notice that it comes off pretty easily. And if you do it in a reverse order of how you sewed it, it naturally likes to tear that way. So that works really well. Now some other things just to remember when you're sewing this, again, I can't emphasize enough to press, not iron, because you do not want to distort your fabric. And the next thing to remember is that, you know, we're all quilters, but before us there was another whole generation of quilters. And people have been making these blocks for several centuries now. There are all kinds of ways to make them. I certainly believe that there are people out there that really are worth mentioning because they have been so inspiring. This is a book you can get from C&T Publishing. It's called Fresh Pineapple Possibilities by Jane Hall and Dixie Haywood. They have some fantastic blocks in here. They share all their sewing ideas and their experiences on how they made quilts, and I really recommend this book. Again, you know, if you have a program, you know, with blocks, that's a great way to get started and sew. But at this point, everything is here. Now, when I made my really large quilt, there are a couple of things to notice. I told you I use this Sew Steady table. I keep this on my machine except for when I machine embroidery. It is always on here, as well as there is a mat that is on here that is a gliding mat, so it's really handy when you are finishing your quilts because it has a slide to it. But with this particular quilt, I could tell you I had 3 friends come over and hold the quilt, but that's not true. What I actually did is I used a frame, it's a portable frame by Sew Steady called a weightless quilter. And what it allowed me to do was to take corners of my quilt and even down the middle and float it in the air or take all the pressure of sewing on it and lift it a little bit so that it made it easy to sew. So any of my large quilts from full size on, I use with my weightless quilter. It just makes it easier. It's kind of like a special gift to yourself. I hope you enjoyed all of these things. I mentioned that if you had a block and it was a little difficult, if you have 2 blocks together and they didn't quite line up, you don't have to take the whole block out. Just take the little section that's running off and a little bit before and after it, and then you can pin it in place and kind of ease it in. If it's kind of a pain and you're nervous, I found that I can use Elmer school glue, kind of press it down, and it holds it in place, and that works really good. I learned a lot about school glue from Sharon Chalmers. She uses it a lot for her bindings. So I hope this answered your questions. Again, there's a PDF file that will have some blocks for you that are available to sew with, and I hope you'll take advantage of that. My email address will show up. I hope that you feel free to send me information. I hope you enjoyed these videos. And again, thanks to all my family. I want to say aloha, and don't forget to spread aloha by giving a quilt to someone you love. Thank you.